Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Denali National Park, Alaska, October 28, 2011. Christopher Brennan heard the scream at 14:47, exactly 212 yards northwest of his position. He knew the distance because he'd been tracking Madison Hayes' boot prints in fresh powder for the last 40 minutes and his handheld GPS. The Garmin unit that kept glitching in the cold had logged every step. The scream cut off mid-breath. Chris ran. His Sorel boots punched through the snow crust, each step sinking 8 inches into powder that had fallen overnight. The Douglas fir trees here grew dense enough to block most of the weak October sunlight, creating corridors of shadow that twisted the landscape into geometric puzzles. His breath came in sharp bursts, visible clouds that hung in air so cold it felt solid. He reached her last position in 90 seconds. The boot prints stopped at the base of a lightning-scarred spruce. Just stopped. No scuffle marks, no drag patterns, no blood spatter on the snow. The prints simply ended as if Madison Hayes had been lifted straight up into the air by something that left no trace. Chris's radio crackled. "Brennan, this is base. Do you copy?" He thumbed the transmit button. "I copy. I've lost visual on the subject. Boot prints terminate at coordinates." He rattled off the numbers, his voice steady despite the weight forming in his chest. That familiar pressure he'd last felt 5 years ago in Olympic National Forest, when he'd found Tom Hendricks's tent empty and the sleeping bag still warm. "Repeat last, Brennan. You're breaking up." The radio hissed static. Chris tapped it against his palm, a useless gesture he'd seen his father make with the old CB radio in their kitchen. The digital display flickered, showing battery at 73%, but the transmission bars dropped to nothing. He was 36 miles from park headquarters, in a section of Denali where the elevation dropped from 3,000 feet to 1,800 in less than 2 miles. The temperature had been falling since noon, currently sitting at -8 Fahrenheit according to his thermometer. Madison Hayes had been wearing a North Face jacket adequate for autumn hiking in Washington state, not Alaskan wilderness in late October. She had maybe 72 hours before hypothermia became academic. Chris studied the surrounding terrain. No broken branches, no disturbed snow beyond Madison's trail. Above him, a raven landed on a dead limb and made a sound that wasn't quite a caw, more like a word spoken in a language with too many consonants. His fingers had gone numb despite the Gore-Tex gloves. He flexed them, feeling the joints crack. The scar tissue on his left palm, a souvenir from Olympic, began to ache in the cold, a phenomenon his doctor had dismissed as psychosomatic. "Madison!" His shout fell flat in the dense timber absorbed by snow and shadow. "Madison Hayes, can you hear me?" Nothing. Not even an echo. He marked the location with orange flagging tape tied to a low branch, then began a spiral search pattern, moving outward in concentric circles. Standard procedure. The kind of thing he'd done 100 times in 12 years as a ranger. The kind of thing that usually worked. At the third circuit, he found something. A boot print. Fresh. Madison's tread pattern, distinct because of the worn left heel. But it was heading back toward her starting point, overlapping her original trail. As if she'd retraced her steps. But Chris had followed those original prints. There had been no return path. He crouched, examining the print more carefully. The depth was wrong. Too shallow, as if made by someone weighing less than Madison's documented 130 pounds, or made by someone not quite substantial. Chris stood quickly, his knees popping. The raven was still watching him. As he met its gaze, it opened its beak and said, "Help me." The voice was human, female. Madison's voice, he thought, though he'd only heard her speak briefly during the pre-hike safety briefing that morning. "Jesus Christ," Chris whispered. The bird tilted its head. "Jesus Christ," it repeated in a different voice. Male, older, with a thickness that suggested smoke damage. Then it launched from the branch and disappeared into the canopy. Chris's heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled out his radio again. Dead. Completely dead now, despite the battery indicator. He tried his cell phone, knowing it was pointless this far into the backcountry. No signal, as expected. The screen showed 4:02 p.m. Sunset would come at 5:47. Full dark by 6:15. He had maybe 90 minutes of usable daylight. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees while he stood there. He could feel it, a physical thing pressing against his skin. His emergency gear included a bivy sack, chemical heat packs, a first aid kit, and 3 days of freeze-dried rations. Standard loadout. He also carried something non-standard. A small leather journal, pocket-sized, filled with notes written in his own hand about Olympic National Forest, 2006. He hadn't opened that journal in 4 years. Chris continued the search pattern, pushing farther from the spruce tree. The snow here was deeper, undisturbed except by animal tracks. Snowshoe hare, red fox, what might have been wolf. Then he found something else. A depression in the snow, roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter. Within this circle, the temperature was noticeably warmer. He could feel it even through his insulated pants. At the center of the circle stood a stone cairn. Chris approached slowly. The cairn was maybe 4 feet tall, constructed from rounded river rocks that must have been carried here. The nearest riverbed was 2 miles east. Each stone was approximately the same size, fitted together with a precision that suggested purpose rather than random stacking. Carved into the topmost stone was a date, July 14th, 1952. Chris knew that date. Every Alaskan Ranger knew it. The Denali wildfire of 1952 had burned for 6 weeks, consuming 48,000 acres. 23 firefighters had died, trapped on a ridgeline when the wind shifted. The official report listed the location as 12 miles south of here, but fire investigations from that era weren't exactly precise. He reached out to touch the cairn, then stopped. His breath, which had been visible in the cold air, had disappeared. He exhaled deliberately. Nothing. No vapor. The temperature was still below zero. His thermometer confirmed it, but his breath no longer condensed. Chris. He spun. Madison Hayes stood 15 feet behind him, wearing the same North Face jacket, the same trail pants, the same Vasca hiking boots. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Her face was pale but unmarked. She looked completely normal except for one detail. She cast no shadow, despite the angled sunlight breaking through the canopy. Madison. Chris kept his voice level. Are you hurt? She didn't answer immediately. Her mouth opened and closed, as if she were trying to remember how to form words. When she finally spoke, the voice was wrong. Too deep, with that same smoke-damaged quality the raven had produced. The fire came from nowhere, she said. We dug line for 8 hours. Then the wind turned. Chris's hand moved to the bear spray on his belt, though he knew it would be useless here. Madison, I need you to stay calm. Tell me what happened after you screamed. Her head tilted at an angle that would have required medical intervention, 45 degrees to the right, past the point where neck muscles should allow. We ran uphill. That was the mistake. Fire moves faster uphill. Jenkins knew it. He kept yelling, but we couldn't hear over the roar. Madison, the smoke got us first. Her voice cracked, shifting registers. Now it sounded younger, almost childlike. I couldn't breathe. My lungs filled with ash. I tried to call my mom, but the radio was melted. Chris took a step back. His boot hit something solid, a rock he hadn't seen. He glanced down. When he looked up again, Madison was gone. In her place stood a man in a ranger uniform from the 1950s. Canvas pants, wool shirt, suspenders. His face was blackened with soot. His hands were burned down to bone in places. You shouldn't be here, the man said in Madison's voice. Then he was gone too. Chris stood alone in the clearing, his pulse throbbing in his temples. The sun had dropped another degree toward the horizon. The shadows were growing longer, more substantial. He could hear something moving through the underbrush to his left. A heavy, rhythmic sound like footsteps, but not quite matching the cadence of human gait. He pulled out the leather journal with shaking hands. The pages were brittle from age and cold. He flipped to the last entry, dated November 12, 2006. Tom Hendricks manifested 3 times before I understood. Each time he spoke in voices that weren't his. Each time he shared memories that couldn't be his own. I documented 12 different voices in 48 hours. The pattern suggests multiple entities sharing a single manifestation point. Doctor, Reeves says I experienced a psychotic break triggered by stress and hypothermia. She's wrong. She didn't see what I saw. She didn't hear them screaming in unison. Chris closed the journal. His hands were trembling, and not just from the cold. Madison, he shouted again, louder this time. If you can hear me, follow my voice. I can help you. The response came from 6 directions simultaneously. Help me. In 23 voices speaking as one, male and female, young and old, all damaged by smoke, all desperate and lost. The sound made his teeth ache. A figure emerged from the tree line directly ahead. Then another from the left, another from behind. Soon there were 7 figures surrounding him, all wearing different clothing spanning different eras. A woman in 1950s hiking gear, a man in Vietnam-era military surplus, a teenage boy in an Eddie Bauer jacket from the 1980s, a young woman in modern trail runners. Madison again, but different somehow, less solid. They all had Madison's face. No, that wasn't quite right. They all had Madison's expression. A confusion mixed with terror, eyes too wide, mouth slightly open. But the features shifted as Chris watched, flickering between identities like channels on a broken television. We couldn't find the way out, they said in imperfect unison, the words overlapping and echoing. The smoke was too thick. The heat melted the soles of our boots. We tried to dig shelter trenches, but the ground was frozen. We called for help, but nobody came. Nobody came. Nobody. Stop, Chris said firmly. I need to speak with Madison Hayes. Just Madison, the girl who came here today. The figures froze. For a moment, the clearing went absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, no sound at all. Then one of the figures stepped forward. This one looked more solid than the others, more present. Madison's face stabilized, stopped flickering. I don't understand what's happening, she said. And this time the voice was right. Young, female, terrified, but trying to stay calm. I was walking the trail. I heard something calling my name. I turned around and then I was somewhere else. Somewhere hot. There was fire everywhere. People were screaming. I tried to run, but I couldn't move. I was them. I was all of them at once. If this story is gripping you, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Chris's position? Share your thoughts. Chris's training said this was impossible. His experience said otherwise. 5 years ago, he'd learned that certain places held echoes. Not metaphorical echoes, but actual imprints of trauma so severe that they created pockets of frozen time. Dr. Reeves had called it a psychological projection. The investigation board had called it a stress-induced delusion. Chris had called it the truth, and they'd put him on administrative leave for 6 months. Madison listened to me carefully. He kept his voice steady, authoritative. You're caught in something, a collective resonance. The firefighters who died here in 1952, their deaths were traumatic enough to leave an imprint. You've become entangled with it. That's insane, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I know, but insane doesn't mean untrue. Chris moved closer, slowly. Can you feel them? Inside your head? Their memories mixing with yours? She nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. I remember burning. I remember my wife waiting at home. I remember graduating high school in 1934. I remember things that never happened to me, but they're as real as my actual memories. I can't tell which ones are mine anymore. The other figures had begun to circle, moving in a slow, synchronized rotation around Chris and Madison. Their mouths moved silently, forming words that created no sound. The temperature continued to drop. Chris's thermometer now read -18. In Olympic, there was a way to break the resonance, Chris said. I had to help the primary consciousness, Tom, separate his identity from the collective. But I couldn't do it. I lost him. He's still there, still trapped, still mixed with whatever claimed him. I don't want to be trapped here, Madison said. Her voice was becoming less stable again, other voices bleeding through. I have an anthropology exam on Wednesday. I was supposed to call my dad tonight. I won't. You won't, Chris said firmly. I won't let that happen. Not again. But even as he said it, he felt the doubt creeping in. The same doubt that had paralyzed him 5 years ago. What if he made it worse? What if his interference pushed Madison deeper into the collective? What if she ended up like Tom Hendricks, perpetually manifesting and dissolving, unable to move forward or back? One of the circling figures stopped directly behind him. Chris felt cold breath on his neck. Impossible since the figures didn't breathe. A hand touched his shoulder, fingers pressing through his parka as if the fabric weren't there. Join us, it whispered in his father's voice. Chris jerked away. His father had died 3 years ago, heart attack, completely unrelated to any of this. The collective was adapting, reaching into his memories, finding leverage. You're not my father, he said without turning around. Join us, the voice repeated, now in Tom Hendricks's voice. You know it's inevitable. You've felt the pull since Olympic. Every time you enter the wilderness alone, you wonder if this will be the time you don't come back. You wonder if disappearing would be easier than explaining what you saw. Chris's jaw clenched. The thing wasn't wrong. There had been moments, standing on ridgelines at dawn, or lying in his tent during storms, when he'd felt something calling. The invitation to step sideways out of reality, to join the lost ones, to stop fighting the knowledge that had driven a wedge between him and everyone who couldn't understand. Chris, Madison said urgently. They're getting stronger. I can feel them pushing harder. I'm losing. Her face flickered, became an old man's face, became a child's face, became something with no face at all. Chris made a decision. He pulled off his right glove and pressed his scarred left palm against the cairn's topmost stone. The scar tissue, burned when he'd grabbed a red-hot tent stake trying to find Tom Hendricks in the dark, made contact with the carved date. The world inverted. Suddenly, Chris wasn't standing in the clearing anymore. He was running through fire, flames 10 feet high on either side, smoke so thick he couldn't see his own hands. People screamed all around him. Someone crashed into him from behind. Jenkins? Was that Jenkins? And they both went down into hot ash that burned through his pants and seared his knees. He tried to stand but couldn't. His lungs wouldn't pull air. He clawed at his throat, felt blisters rising on his fingertips. The heat was inside him now, cooking his organs. His vision darkened at the edges. Someone was calling for their mother. Someone else was praying in Spanish. Someone else was laughing, a high, hysterical sound that broke into sobbing. This isn't real, Chris thought desperately. This is their memory. This is 1952. I'm in 2011. I'm Christopher Brennan. I'm 42 years old. My badge number is 7841. My father's name was Robert. My mother's name was Catherine. I live at 2847 Maple Street in... The identity anchors worked. Barely. Chris felt the fire memory begin to loosen its grip. He forced his eyes open, or thought he did. He might have been hallucinating the entire concept of eyes, and saw the clearing again, overlaid with the burning ridge like a double-exposed photograph. Madison was kneeling in the snow, hands pressed to her head, screaming silently. The circling figures had multiplied. There were dozens now, maybe hundreds, all flickering between identities, all sharing Madison's expression of desperate confusion. Chris understood with sudden, terrible clarity. Madison was the newest addition to the collective. Her consciousness was being absorbed, integrated. In moments, she would cease to exist as an individual. She would become part of the chorus, one voice among 24 screaming for help that would never come. Unless... Chris yanked his hand off the cairn and stumbled forward, grabbing Madison by both shoulders. The contact was like touching a live wire. Every nerve in his body fired at once. He felt himself beginning to slip into the collective, felt 23 other minds reaching for his, hungry for fresh experience, for memories that didn't taste like smoke and failure. "Madison Hayes," he shouted directly into her face. "Student at University of Washington, anthropology major. You have a roommate named Jen. You're allergic to shellfish. Your favorite movie is The Princess Bride. Your dad's birthday is March 9th. You're afraid of spiders. You..." "Stop," she gasped. "Stop. I remember. I remember." "Then hold on to it." Chris shook her, maybe too hard, but desperation made him rough. "Tell me who you are, not them. You." Madison's eyes focused. For a moment, just a moment, they were only her eyes. "I'm Madison Elizabeth Hayes," she whispered. "I'm 19 years old. I came to Alaska to study Athabascan cultural sites. I got lost. I'm not a firefighter. I didn't die in 1952. I'm alive. I'm still alive." The figures surrounding them let out a collective wail, not angry but mournful, envious. They pressed closer, reaching with translucent hands. Chris felt them trying to pull Madison back, trying to drag him in with her. "We need to break the physical anchor," Chris said quickly. "The cairn. It's holding the resonance. If we scatter the stones..." "No." Madison's voice was suddenly stronger. "That would trap them forever. They're not evil, Chris. They're just lost. They died in terror and pain. And they've been stuck here for 60 years, unable to move on because they can't separate from each other. They're a knot that's been pulled too tight." Chris stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I can feel what they feel. I'm still connected." She looked at the surrounding figures, the way their faces flickered, the way they moved in unconscious synchronization. They don't want to hurt anyone. They want someone to see them, to acknowledge what happened, to say their names. "There are 23 names," Chris said. "I don't know them." "I do." Madison stood, shaky but determined. "I'm an anthropology student, remember? I research death rituals. I know about the 1952 fire. I read the incident report last month." She turned to face the figures. Chris wanted to stop her, wanted to pull her back, but something in her posture told him this was necessary. This was why she'd been caught. Not random chance, but some kind of terrible synchronicity. The right person in the wrong place, or maybe the wrong person in exactly the right place. Madison began to speak names. Harold Jenkins, fire crew boss, age 37. One of the figures stepped forward. The flickering slowed. A middle-aged man's face stabilized, became distinct. Robert Matthews, age 22, engaged to be married. Another figure clarified, a young man with a wedding ring on his left hand. Sarah Chen, age 29, first female firefighter in Alaska. A woman emerged from the collective, her features sharpening into individuality. Madison continued through all 23 names, pulling each consciousness forward, giving them back their identities. With each name, the figures became more solid, more separate. The overlapping voices resolved into distinct speakers. The collective began to unweave itself. When Madison spoke the last name, Thomas Whitmore, age 18, his first fire, the youngest figure stepped forward. He looked terrified but also relieved, as if he'd been waiting for someone to remember he existed. The clearing fell silent. 23 figures stood in a loose circle, no longer synchronized, no longer speaking in unison. They looked at each other as if seeing themselves clearly for the first time in 60 years. Some were crying, some were smiling. One, Harold Jenkins, nodded at Madison with something like gratitude. Then, one by one, they faded. Not violently, not dramatically. They simply became less present, less insistent, less here, like fog burning off in morning sun. Within 30 seconds, the clearing was empty except for Chris and Madison, both shivering in the increasing cold, breath visible again in the -20 air. Madison's knees buckled. Chris caught her before she hit the snow. She was crying, great racking sobs that shook her entire body. "I felt them leave," she gasped between breaths. "I felt them let go. They were so tired, Chris. So tired of being stuck. Chris held her up, his own legs not entirely steady. The sun had nearly set. The temperature was still dropping. They had maybe 30 minutes of twilight left, and it was a 3-hour hike back to the trailhead. "We need to move," he said gently. "Can you walk?" "I think so." She pulled away, standing on her own. Her face was streaked with half-frozen tears, but her eyes were clear, fully her own. "Chris, in Olympic, did you try speaking their names?" He shook his head. "I didn't know them. I couldn't find the records. The case was too old, too obscure." "Tom Hendricks," Madison said quietly. "That's who you lost, right? The name you mentioned before?" "Yes." "Maybe." She hesitated. "Maybe that's why you came here. To learn. So next time—" "There won't be a next time," Chris interrupted. But the words felt hollow even as he said them. He'd thought the same thing after Olympic. He'd thought if he just avoided remote wilderness, avoided the places where trauma had soaked into the landscape, he could pretend the world made sense again. But the world didn't make sense. It had never made sense, and people like him and Madison, people who could see the cracks in reality, who could hear the voices of the lost, they didn't get to pretend otherwise. Chris pulled out his radio. It crackled to life immediately, battery still at 73%, signal strong. "Base, this is Brennan. I have the missing hiker. She's hypothermic but stable. Requesting medical at trailhead. ETA 3 hours." "Copy that, Brennan. Medical will be standing by. Good work." Chris clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Madison. "You ready?" She glanced back at the cairn one more time. "Will they be okay? The 23? "I don't know," Chris admitted. "But they're not trapped anymore. That's something." They started walking. The hike out was brutal. Temperature dropping to -25, wind picking up, snow beginning to fall again. But they made it. 3 hours and 17 minutes later, they reached the trailhead where the medical team was waiting with blankets and hot coffee and concerned questions about frostbite. Madison was admitted to the hospital in Fairbanks for overnight observation. Chris filed his report, leaving out certain details that would raise questions he didn't want to answer. The official record stated that Madison had become disoriented due to early-stage hypothermia and had wandered off trail. Ranger Brennan had located her using standard search protocols. No anomalies, no complications. The investigation board accepted the report without comment. 3 days later, Chris received a text message from an unknown number. "I looked up Tom Hendricks. Olympic National Forest, 2006. I found the names. All 7 of them. If you want to try again, I'll help." Chris stared at the message for a long time. His thumb hovered over the delete button. It would be easy to erase it, to forget, to go back to pretending, to accept Dr. Reeves's explanation that it had all been stress and hypothermia and psychological projection. But he'd never been good at pretending. He typed a single word. "When?" The response came immediately. "Spring. After the thaw. I'll do the research. You bring the experience." Chris closed his phone and looked out his apartment window at the mountains in the distance. Somewhere out there, in Olympic National Forest, 7 voices were still calling, still waiting for someone to see them, to say their names, to let them rest. He opened his leather journal and turned to a blank page. At the top he wrote, "Olympic National Forest, 2006. Thomas Hendricks, age 24. Sarah Riley, age 31. Marcus Washington, age 27. He would learn all 7 names. He would go back, and this time, because of what happened in Denali, because of what Madison had taught him, he would do it right. The lost deserved to be found. The forgotten deserved to be remembered. And the ones who could see and hear what others couldn't, people like him and Madison, they had a responsibility to try. Even if it meant walking back into the places that terrified them. Even if it meant risking becoming lost themselves. Especially then. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. Chris watched the flakes drift past his window and thought about fire and ice, about memory and identity, about the thin line between helping and being consumed. He thought about Madison Hayes, who would carry the memories of 23 deaths for the rest of her life. He thought about Tom Hendricks and the 6 others still waiting in Olympic. Then he closed the journal, turned off the light, and tried to sleep. In his dreams, he heard voices calling his name, but this time, he wasn't afraid to answer. Thanks for reading. If you enjoyed this narrative, follow for more compelling stories. What's your interpretation of Madison's fate? I'd love to read your theories. Tentar novamente o Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas. The radio crackled at 5:47 a.m., pulling Christopher Walsh from a dream he'd already forgotten. He fumbled for the handset in the dark, his fingers finding the familiar grooves worn into the plastic over 11 years of service. "Walsh, you there?" It was Maria Chen, her voice tight with something that made him sit up. "Copy. What's the situation?" "We've got a missing researcher. Emma Hartley, 24, graduate student with UW. Wolf observation team up at Desolation Creek. Her colleagues say she left camp around 11 last night to check remote cameras. Never came back." Christopher was already pulling on his pants, phone wedged between shoulder and ear. Through the window of the ranger station, the Cascades were still dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. Weather last night? Clear until about 2 a.m., then fog rolled in heavy. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Equipment status? That's the thing. Maria paused. They found her pack at 0430. Half-mile from camp, just sitting on the trail. Radio, GPS unit, water, first aid kit, all there. Her headlamp was on. Battery's dead. Christopher's hand stopped on his bootlace. She wouldn't leave her gear. No, she wouldn't. 20 minutes later, he was loading his truck, a 2008 Ford Ranger that had seen better days but knew every fire road in the park. The sky was shifting from black to gray, that particular quality of pre-dawn light that made everything look uncertain. He checked his pack methodically. Garmin GPS unit, fully charged, extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency bivy, water purification tablets, 500 feet of paracord, flares. His satellite phone, the clunky Iridium model that weighed 2 pounds but worked when nothing else did. His service weapon, a Glock 22, which he'd drawn exactly 3 times in 11 years, always for injured animals. The drive up Highway 20 took 40 minutes, then another 30 on Forest Road 3100, which wasn't really a road so much as an optimistic suggestion carved into the mountainside. The pine trees grew so thick here that full daylight looked like late evening. At 4,800 feet, he turned onto a logging track that hadn't seen timber operation since the 90s. The research camp was tucked into a clearing near the creek. 2 tents, a tarp shelter, and 3 very frightened graduate students. Christopher recognized the type. Smart, competent in their field, utterly unprepared for what the wilderness could do when it decided to stop being picturesque. The team leader was a kid named Marcus, maybe 26, with expensive hiking boots that hadn't yet molded to his feet. "Ranger Walsh, thank God. We've been calling Emma's cell, but there's no signal up here. Walk me through it." Christopher pulled out his notebook, an actual paper notebook because batteries died and touchscreens cracked. Everything from the beginning. Marcus's hands shook as he unfolded a topographical map. "We're tracking the Desolation Pack. 9 wolves, 2 breeding pairs. We've got remote cameras set up in a grid pattern, roughly square-mile coverage. Emma was checking the northwestern stations. She left at 23:15 hours. She was always precise about time. Said she'd be back by 0200 at the latest. Anyone go with her?" She insisted on going alone. Said we were spooking the wolves with too many of us moving around. Marcus dragged his hand through his hair. "She's been doing this for 8 months. She knows these trails better than we know our apartment. Show me where you found the pack." They hiked northwest on a trail that was barely there, just a depression in the undergrowth that might have been a game path. The fog hadn't fully burned off and it clung to the low places, moving like something half alive. Christopher noticed things. Fresh wolf scat, maybe 6 hours old. Scratches on a Douglas fir at exactly the height a territorial male would mark. a raven watching them from a snag, silent. The pack sat in the middle of the trail, upright, as if Emma had set it down intending to pick it back up. Christopher crouched beside it without touching anything, studying the ground. The soil here was soft, covered in a layer of decomposed needles. Emma's boot prints approached from the south. He could see the distinctive tread of Salomon trail runners, size 7, women's. She'd stopped here, turned in a circle, judging by the scuff marks. Then her tracks led off the trail heading west, into the cedar grove. Christopher felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He stood slowly, looking toward the thick stand of old-growth western red cedars maybe 200 yards off the trail. The trees there were different, darker. He'd patrolled this area for over a decade and he'd never once gone into that grove. "The pack's been here all night," he said, pulling on latex gloves and carefully opening the main compartment. Everything Marcus described was there, neatly organized. Emma's wallet with her driver's license, a smiling photo that seemed obscene now. A Cliff Bar half-eaten, a field journal with neat handwriting documenting wolf behavior patterns. The last entry was time-stamped 23/07. Alpha male marking heavily around NW7 camera. Unusual aggression toward NW4 female. Need to review footage. The GPS unit screen was dark. Christopher turned it on. Full battery. Last waypoint recorded at 2342, N48 degree 44, 236, W121 dig 10.557. Right at the edge of the cedar grove. "We need to call this in," Christopher said. "Get a full search team up here." "How long will that take?" 4 hours minimum. County SAR has to mobilize, and the terrain up here..." He stopped. 4 hours. In 72 hours, survival rates dropped by half. After that, they usually weren't searching for someone alive. "I'm going to start a preliminary sweep. You 3 stay here. Anyone gets tired or scared, you hike back to camp. Do not go looking for her on your own." Marcus nodded, trying to look capable. Is there anything we can do?" "Yeah, pray the fog doesn't come back." Christopher moved carefully through the underbrush following Emma's trail. She'd been moving deliberately at first, her stride even, but after 50 yards the tracks became erratic. She'd started running. He stopped, studying the ground. Running from what? There were no other human tracks, no animal tracks large enough to threaten an adult. Just Emma's prints, desperate and panicked, leading straight toward the cedar grove. The trees ahead were massive, 500 years old at least, their bark hanging in long strips like peeling skin. The canopy was so thick that almost nothing grew underneath. Just bare earth and a carpet of rust-colored needles. The air smelled different here. Wetter. Older. Christopher had been a ranger for 11 years. Before that, 8 years with the Forest Service. 2 in Alaska, where the winter darkness did things to people's minds. He'd found lost hikers, talked down suicidal campers, dealt with bears, cougars, and one memorably aggressive moose. He considered himself grounded, rational. Someone who understood that wilderness was dangerous because of physics and biology, not because of spirits or curses. But he'd also worked with Tommy Redhawk, a Sauk Seattle ranger who'd grown up on stories about these mountains, and Tommy had told him once casually, while they were clearing a deadfall, "My grandfather said there are places in the Cascades where the old agreements still hold, places where the mountain decides who leaves and who stays." Christopher had laughed at the time. He wasn't laughing now. He checked his GPS, N48 dig 44.198, B120 20 10.5115. The device was working, but the signal showed only 4 satellites instead of the usual 8 or 9. His radio hissed with static when he tried to raise the students. Nothing. His cell phone showed no bars, which was expected, but the battery indicator was flickering erratically, despite being fully charged an hour ago. Emma's tracks led him between 2 massive cedars, their trunks so wide he couldn't see around them. On the far side, he found the first camera, a Bushnell trail camera strapped to a young hemlock at chest height. The camera's casing was intact, but the mounting strap had been shredded. Not cut, shredded. The heavy nylon torn as if something with considerable strength had ripped at it. The camera had fallen into the underbrush. Christopher picked it up carefully. The lens was intact. The timestamp on the screen showed it had been recording until 23:44 last night, then abruptly stopped. He ejected the SD card and pocketed it. Maybe the footage would show something. Maybe Emma had encountered an animal, panicked, ran. Bears sometimes. A sound cut through his thoughts. A whistle. 3 sharp notes, coming from deeper in the grove. The distress signal. Christopher's training took over. He moved quickly but carefully, avoiding exposed roots, keeping his breathing controlled. Emma Hartley, this is Ranger Walsh with Park Service. If you can hear me, stay where you are and keep signaling. The whistle came again, same 3 notes, but from a different direction, north instead of west. He stopped, disoriented. Sound could do strange things in dense forest, bouncing off trees, creating false echoes. But that hadn't sounded like an echo. It sounded like 2 different sources. Emma, I need you to answer me verbally. Can you speak? Silence. Then from behind him, 3 sharp whistles. Christopher spun around, hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. The grove was empty. Just trees and shadows and the morning light filtering down in dusty columns. His radio crackled. Through the static, a voice. Help me, please. Emma, what's your location? Can't find the way out. Everything looks the same. Stay calm. Keep talking to me. What do you see around you? The static intensified, became almost painful. Through it, fragmented. The trees, they moved. I swear they moved. Then nothing. Just the empty hiss of dead air. Christopher tried his sat phone. The screen lit up but showed no signal bars. Impossible for an iridium unit. They worked everywhere, even at the poles. He turned in a slow circle, trying to get his bearings. The grove seemed bigger than it should be. The trees pressed in close, their branches interlocking overhead in patterns that hurt to look at directly. A cairn caught his eye, a stack of stones about 3 feet high sitting in a small clearing 20 yards ahead. He moved toward it. As he got closer, he saw that the stones were arranged in a specific pattern, each one carefully selected and placed. At the base of the cairn was something that made him stop breathing. A ranger badge. Brass, tarnished green with age. He picked it up carefully. The engraving was still visible. Samuel T. Ridgway, Forest Ranger, 1952. Christopher knew that name. Every ranger in the Cascades knew that name. Samuel Ridgway had disappeared in 1952 while investigating reports of missing hikers. They'd found his truck at a trailhead, his gear still inside. They'd searched for 3 weeks. The investigation concluded he'd probably fallen into a ravine, body never recovered. This badge was sitting at the base of a cairn in a grove that supposedly no one entered. If this story is holding your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Christopher's situation? Push deeper into the grove or turn back? Share your thoughts. The ground beneath the cairn was different, darker. He knelt down and brushed away needles with his gloved hand. The soil was black, rich, volcanic, and carved into it, barely visible, were symbols. Lines and circles and shapes that might have been pictographs, or might have been simple erosion, but their arrangement suggested intention. A boundary marker, maybe. Or a warning. Christopher stood, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the silence of a place that had decided to stop pretending to be normal forest. His grandfather had been Lummi, though Christopher had grown up far from the reservation, disconnected from that heritage. But he remembered his grandfather saying once, "The land remembers longer than we do, and what it remembers, it keeps." He took out his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to settle on magnetic north. He tried the GPS again. The screen showed his position as N48D44.203, W121D10522. But according to the map, those coordinates should put him in the middle of Desolation Creek. He was standing on dry land surrounded by cedars at least a quarter mile from any water. Something was very wrong with this place. A flash of color caught his eye. Orange, bright against the dark undergrowth. He pushed through a tangle of salal bushes and found Emma's jacket, neatly folded and placed on a fallen log. Her name was written on the tag in permanent marker. The fabric was dry, no dew, no moisture. It had been here less than an hour. "Emma!" His voice sounded flat, swallowed by the trees. "Emma, if you can hear me, I found your jacket. I need you to make a sound." No response. But he saw now that there was a trail of sorts, not a path, but objects placed at intervals. Emma's water bottle, 30 feet farther in. Her GPS unit, another 40 feet. Her field journal open to a blank page. Each item placed with care, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the grove. Christopher's training screamed at him to stop, to call for backup, to not follow an obvious trail left by someone who was either severely impaired or who wasn't Emma at all. But his training also said that in the first 24 hours, every minute mattered. Emma had been missing for 7 hours. If she was injured, hypothermic, lost. He followed the trail. The grove changed as he moved deeper. The cedars grew closer together, their trunks fused in places, creating arches and tunnels. The light shifted from morning gray to something that couldn't decide what time of day it wanted to be. His watch showed 7:23 a.m., but the shadows suggested late afternoon. Emma's radio appeared on a moss-covered boulder. Then her belt knife, carefully placed on a tree stump. Her wool cap hung on a low branch. Christopher stopped walking. This wasn't the behavior of someone lost and panicked. This was deliberate. This was someone, or something, trying to lure him deeper. He turned to head back. The grove looked different. The trees had closed in somehow, the gaps between them narrower than he remembered. He could see his own boot prints in the soft earth, but they seemed to lead in multiple directions, as if he'd walked in circles without realizing it. The compass was still useless. He checked the GPS, the screen flickered, showing impossible coordinates, then went dark completely. A branch snapped behind him. He spun, hand on his weapon. A figure stood between two cedars, maybe 50 feet away. Small, slight build. Dark hair. Emma. The figure didn't move. In the strange light of the grove, he couldn't make out details. Just a silhouette, human-shaped, watching him. "Emma, it's Ranger Walsh. I'm here to help you. Are you injured?" The figure turned and walked deeper into the grove, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost to glide over the uneven ground. Christopher followed, because what else could he do? He kept his distance, staying alert, one hand near his weapon. The figure led him through a section of grove so dense he had to turn sideways to fit between the trunks. The bark scraped his jacket, leaving rust-colored stains. Then he stepped into a clearing he shouldn't have been able to reach without crossing Desolation Creek. But here it was, a perfect circle of bare earth, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by ancient cedars. In the center of the clearing was another cairn, much larger than the first, 10 feet high at least, built from river stones that must have weighed hundreds of pounds each. And sitting at the base of the cairn, very much alive, was Emma Hartley. She looked up as he entered the clearing, her face pale but unmarked. "Ranger Walsh?" Her voice was hoarse, uncertain. "How did you find me?" Christopher approached slowly, studying her for signs of injury. "Your team reported you missing. Are you hurt?" I don't think so." She touched her head experimentally as if checking for wounds. "I got turned around. The fog came in and I couldn't find the trail. I've been trying to get back to camp, but everything looks the same. How long have you been sitting here?" "I don't know. An hour, maybe." She looked around the clearing, confused. "What time is it?" "Almost 8 a.m. You've been missing since midnight." Her eyes widened. That can't be right. I left camp at 11:30. I checked the camera and then..." She stopped, her face going blank. I don't remember what happened next." Christopher knelt beside her, checking her pupils. Slightly dilated but responsive. No obvious signs of head trauma, but that didn't mean much. "Do you remember finding your way to this clearing?" "No. I was on the trail, near the camera, and then I was here. Like I blinked and missed everything in between. Time loss. Disorientation. It could be a concussion or hypothermia or any number of medical conditions. But Emma's core temperature seemed fine. She wasn't shivering. Her speech was clear. She was scared, but lucid. "Can you walk?" "I think so." She stood, testing her legs. "Everything feels wrong though, like I'm moving through water." Christopher pulled out his radio, tried again to raise the students. Still nothing but static. "We need to get you out of here and checked by a medic. Stay close to me, watch your footing." They started across the clearing, heading toward what Christopher hoped was south. Emma walked beside him, quiet, occasionally glancing back at the cairn. "Ranger Walsh, do you know what this place is?" "Just an old-growth grove, cedar. Some of these trees are 500-600 years old." "No, I mean..." She hesitated. "Do you know why it feels like this?" He did. He'd been trying not to think about it, but he did. "What does it feel like to you?" "Like it's watching us. Like it's deciding something." They reached the edge of the clearing. Christopher looked for his own boot prints from when he'd entered, but the ground was undisturbed. No tracks at all, not even Emma's. He checked his compass. The needle finally settled, pointing northeast. According to the compass, south was directly back toward the cairn. "This way," he said, choosing a gap between two cedars that looked slightly more passable than the others. The grove swallowed them immediately. Within 10 steps, the clearing was invisible behind them. Within 20, Christopher wasn't sure which direction they'd come from. Emma stopped walking. "Ranger Walsh, I need to tell you something about last night." "Save it, focus on moving." "No, you need to hear this." Her voice had changed, becoming more urgent. "When I was checking the camera, the one near here, I saw something in the footage, from 3 nights ago. A person walking through the grove, but the way they moved, it wasn't right." Christopher kept walking, scanning for landmarks. "Probably just one of your team. At 3 in the morning, moving without a headlamp." She grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "I rewound the footage, watched it 5 times. They weren't walking, they were floating, 6 inches off the ground." A sound reached them through the trees. A long, low note like wind through a canyon, except there was no wind. The cedars around them shuddered, their branches moving in patterns that had nothing to do with air currents. Emma's hand tightened on his arm. "It's happening again." "What's happening?" "The same thing from last night, right before I lost time." The sound came again, closer now, resonating in Christopher's chest. His vision blurred at the edges. The trees seemed to ripple, their bark flowing like water. He blinked hard, trying to clear his head. "Don't listen to it," Emma said. "If you listen too long, you forget which way is out." Christopher pulled away from her, fumbling for his sat phone. The screen was displaying text, but not in English, symbols he didn't recognize, flowing across the display like a corrupted file. He shut it off, shoved it in his pocket. "We need to move, now." They pushed through the grove, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The sound followed them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, impossible to locate. Christopher's sense of direction was completely gone. He was navigating by instinct now, choosing paths that felt right even when they looked wrong. Then he saw them, boot prints, his own, from earlier. They'd walked in a complete circle. "We're going the wrong way," Emma said quietly. "There is no right way." The words came out before he could stop them. "This place doesn't want us to leave." Emma looked at him, her expression shifting from fear to something else. Recognition, maybe. "You know about this, about what lives here?" Christopher didn't answer. He was remembering Tommy Redhawk's words. The old agreements, places where the mountain decided who left and who stayed. "I need you to tell me the truth," Emma said, "because I can't keep pretending this is normal. Can't keep telling myself I'm just lost." Christopher met her eyes. She deserved honesty. "My partner, former partner," he said his people had stories about certain groves in the Cascades, places where something old lives, something that was here before the first humans. It doesn't like being disturbed, doesn't like people on its land. What happens to people who disturb it? Some of them come back, most don't. Emma absorbed this, surprisingly calm. So what do we do? I don't know. Tommy never told me that part. Maybe because no one ever came back to tell how they escaped. The sound came again, and this time Christopher recognized it for what it was. Not wind, not an animal. A voice. Ancient and enormous, speaking in a language that predated words. It reverberated through the earth, through the trees, through his bones. The cedars around them began to move. Not swaying, moving. Their trunks sliding across the ground, their roots crawling through soil, closing off the gaps between them, blocking every potential exit. Emma's face was white. It's going to keep us here. No. Christopher forced his voice steady. No, it's not. But he had no plan, no strategy, just a desperate certainty that he couldn't let Emma die in this grove, couldn't let her become another name in the list of people who'd walked into the Cascades and never walked out. The cairn, the one in the clearing with Emma. It hadn't been built by hikers or rangers. It had been built by the grove itself from stones carried up from the creek, a territorial marker, a grave marker. Christopher turned back the way they'd come. The clearing. We need to get back to the clearing. That's where it's strongest. I know, but it's also where we found each other. It's the center of this place. He started moving, no longer trying to navigate, just surrendering to the pull of the grove. Let it take them where it wanted. Let it lead them back to the heart. The trees parted almost willingly now, creating a clear path. Within minutes, they were standing in the clearing again, the massive cairn rising before them like an altar. What now? Emma whispered. Christopher looked at the cairn, at the carefully placed stones, at the clearing that couldn't exist according to any map. Tommy said these places operate on old agreements, rules. We broke one by entering uninvited. How do we fix that? We ask permission. He felt foolish saying it, but everything else had failed. We acknowledge this place for what it is. He stepped forward, placed both hands on the cairn. The stone was warm, almost body temperature. He cleared his throat, feeling ridiculous, but doing it anyway. We didn't mean to trespass. We were looking for Emma. She didn't know this was your territory. He paused, trying to find words that felt true. We're not here to harm anything. We're just trying to get home. Silence. The voice had stopped. The trees stood motionless. Then, slowly, the feeling of pressure lifted. The air became breathable again. Christopher's compass needle steadied, pointing firmly north. Emma was staring at him. Did that just work? I don't know. He checked his GPS. It powered on, showing their actual location. N48 Digwaror 229, 121 Dig 10 503 Oyer. According to the map, they were less than 300 yards from where they'd started. They left the clearing, walking side by side. This time the grove let them pass. The trees maintained their spacing. The ground sloped downward naturally. After 5 minutes, Christopher heard the sound of running water. Desolation Creek. After 10 minutes, they broke through the tree line and stepped onto the trail. The research students were exactly where he'd left them, though they jumped up when they saw Emma. "Oh my God," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "We were about to come looking." "Don't," Christopher said sharply. "Don't go into that grove. Not today, not ever." They got Emma back to camp, wrapped her in a sleeping bag, made her drink water and eat protein bars. She was physically fine. No injuries, normal temperature, no signs of the 7-hour ordeal she'd just survived. But her hands shook as she held the mug of instant coffee Marcus made for her. Christopher radioed down to headquarters, called off the full SR team. Located and safe, mild exposure, no medical transport needed. Maria's voice through the radio sounded relieved but confused. She'd ask questions later. The sun was fully up now, burning off the last wisps of fog. The Cascades looked exactly as they always did. Beautiful, indifferent, ancient. Emma watched him pack up his gear. "What do we tell people about what happened in there?" "We tell them you got disoriented in the fog, spent the night waiting for daylight. I found you at first light, brought you back. That's all. That's a lie. That's the only story anyone will believe. He checked his compass one final time, confirming it was working normally. You could tell the truth, but they'd pull your research permit. Maybe send you for a psych eval. Is that what you want? She looked toward the cedar grove, barely visible through the younger pines. No, I just want to finish my degree and get out of here. Smart choice. As Christopher drove back down the mountain, his radio crackled with routine traffic. Hikers asking about trail conditions, other rangers reporting in. Normal, mundane, the real world reasserting itself. But when he got back to his station and plugged Emma's camera SD card into his computer, he saw what she'd been talking about. The footage from 3 nights ago, timestamp 0317, a figure moving through the grove. Human-shaped, but not quite human moving, its feet never quite touching the ground. Walking between the cedars with purpose, as if patrolling a border only it could see. Christopher watched the clip 3 times, then deleted it. Some things didn't need to be documented. That night he called Tommy Redhawk, who was now stationed up at Mount Baker. After the usual pleasantries, Christopher asked, "Those old agreements you mentioned, the places where the mountain decides, what happens if you break the agreement and survive?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather said it means you were marked, that the place let you go but didn't forget you, that you owed it something, a debt to be collected later, on terms you wouldn't choose." "What kind of debt?" He never said, but he told me about a ranger who went into one of those places and came back. 30 years later, the ranger disappeared during a routine patrol. They found him at the edge of the same grove, sitting peacefully against a tree. Dead for 3 days, but his body showed no cause of death. Just stopped living, like he'd paid what was owed. Christopher looked out his window at the dark shapes of the Cascades. That ranger, was it Samuel Ridgway? "Yeah. How did you—" Tommy stopped. "Chris, where were you today?" "Desolation Creek, Cedar Grove, northwest of the research camp." "Jesus, that's one of the strong places. My grandfather said his father watched someone walk into that grove in the 1930s, walked straight in like they were going home, and no one ever saw them again." Tommy's voice dropped. "You went in and came out?" "Yeah, brought someone out with me." "Then you're marked now, both of you. The grove will remember." After he hung up, Christopher sat in the dark for a long time watching the mountains. He thought about the cairn, about Ridgway's badge, about all the people who'd walked into the Cascades over the decades and simply vanished. He thought about Emma, driving home to Seattle, probably telling herself it was just stress and exhaustion and not admitting what they'd both felt in that grove. He thought about the debt. And he wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, what price the mountains would eventually demand for letting them leave. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what lives in the Cedar Grove? A guardian spirit, a psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Christopher Brennan had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 14 years, and in that time he'd learned that the forest didn't lie. It told you everything you needed to know if you paid attention. Broken branches indicated direction of travel. Disturbed soil revealed recent activity. Animal tracks spoke of predator and prey. The forest was a book written in a language of evidence and deduction, and Chris prided himself on being fluent in it. Which was why Rachel Martinez's campsite made absolutely no sense. The morning air hung thick with moisture as Chris stood at the perimeter of the small clearing, 17 miles from the nearest trailhead. 4 days. That's how long Rachel had been missing. 4 days since the wildlife researcher had radioed in her last position. 4 days since anyone had heard her voice. The search and rescue coordinator had deployed teams across the Hoh Rainforest Quadrant, but Chris had insisted on checking this location personally. Rachel's research focused on northern spotted owls, and this area had the highest concentration of old-growth forest where the birds nested. He'd found her tent exactly where he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was everything else. The tent itself stood undamaged, its green nylon walls rippling slightly in the breeze that whispered through the Sitka spruce canopy overhead. Rachel's backpack sat propped against a log near the cold fire ring. Her sleeping bag lay partly unrolled inside the tent, visible through the open flap. Nothing appeared disturbed or ransacked. No signs of a struggle, no indication of animal intrusion. The food bag still hung properly from a high branch, bear-safe and intact. But there were other things. Wrong things. Chris circled the campsite slowly, his trained eye cataloging details. Feathers littered the ground in unusual concentrations, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all from owls based on their mottled brown and cream coloring. That alone wasn't alarming. Owls molted and Rachel had been studying them, but the sheer volume and the way they seemed to form rough circular patterns around the tent set off quiet alarm bells in the analytical part of his mind that had kept him alive in these woods for over a decade. Then there were the marks on the trees. 6 Douglas firs surrounding the clearing bore identical symbols carved into their bark at roughly shoulder height. Chris approached the nearest one, running his fingers over the cuts, fresh, no more than a few days old based on the sap still seeping from the wounds. The symbol looked like a crude representation of an eye with claw marks radiating from it. Chris pulled out his digital camera and photographed each one methodically. Vandalism? But who would hike 17 miles into the wilderness just to carve symbols? His radio crackled. "Brennan, this is base. Any sign of Martinez?" "Over." Chris pressed the transmit button. "Found her campsite. No sign of Rachel herself. Site is unusual. I need more time here." "Over." "Copy that. Weather's deteriorating. You've got maybe 3 hours before the rain hits." "Over." Chris acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt. The sky had indeed darkened, clouds rolling in from the Pacific with the promise of the heavy autumn rain that gave this rainforest its name. He needed to work fast. Inside the tent, Rachel's belongings were meticulously organized, typical for a researcher. Field journals stacked neatly, recording equipment carefully packed, clothing folded. Chris pulled on latex gloves from his pack and carefully opened the topmost journal. Rachel's handwriting filled the pages with observation notes, GPS coordinates, and sketched diagrams of owl pellets and nesting sites. But the last few entries were different. October 14th, 2011. The calls have changed. I've been recording spotted owl vocalizations for 3 years, and I've never heard anything like what I captured last night. It's not in any of the literature. Playing it back makes my skin crawl. It sounds almost like human screaming mixed with the typical 4-note hoot. Equipment malfunction. Need to review recordings. October 15th. Found tracks around camp this morning. Large owl prints, but the stride length is impossible. Would require a bird with a body mass of at least 40-50 pounds. No owl species comes close to that size. The prints lead away from camp toward the old cedar grove. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The grove was full of feathers, thousands of them, arranged in patterns on the ground. In the center, something that looked like, I don't know what it looked like, remains, but nothing I could identify. The smell was overwhelming. Decay and something else, something acrid and wrong. Found more of those eye symbols carved into the trees, starting to think I should leave. But the scientist in me needs to understand what I'm seeing. October 16th. They're watching me. I can feel it. Last night I woke to see shadows moving outside the tent, huge, impossible silhouettes against the moonlight. When I looked out, there was nothing. But this morning there were more feathers, arranged in circles around my tent. 7 circles, 7 different sizes. The symbols on the trees have multiplied. There are 13 now. I'm not alone out here. The entry ended there. That was 3 days ago. Chris's hands had gone cold despite his gloves. He flipped through the remaining pages, all blank. He checked the recording equipment and found multiple audio files dated from the past week. Pulling out his own device, he copied the files for later analysis. A sound made him freeze. It came from above. A low guttural hoot that resonated through the clearing with unnatural depth. Chris emerged from the tent and scanned the canopy. Nothing visible, but the forest had gone silent in that way that meant something was very wrong. No bird calls, no small mammals rustling through undergrowth, just that oppressive, watching silence. Another hoot, this time from a different direction, then another, and another. Chris counted 7 distinct calls from 7 different positions surrounding the clearing. His rational mind insisted they were just owls, but every instinct screamed otherwise. Spotted owls didn't vocalize like this during the day. They didn't coordinate calls. And the sounds themselves carried a quality that made his throat tight, something in the timbre that his brain kept trying to interpret as words. The rain began. Chris made a quick decision. He couldn't pack out all of Rachel's equipment in one trip, but he could take the essentials, her journals, the recording equipment, her personal identification. He worked quickly, stuffing items into his pack while the rain intensified from drizzle to downpour. The temperature was dropping fast. As he worked, he noticed something he'd missed before. Near the cold fire ring, partially buried in the soft earth, was a small carved stone. Chris picked it up, brushing away mud. It was polished black stone, maybe obsidian, carved with the same eye and claw symbol from the trees. But this one was old, the carving worn smooth, clearly decades or centuries old. Not something Rachel would have brought. The hooting had stopped, but Chris felt more exposed in the silence. He photographed the entire campsite from multiple angles, then made another discovery that sent ice through his veins. On the far side of the clearing, barely visible in the undergrowth, was a narrow trail he'd initially missed. Fresh broken branches indicated recent passage. Chris approached carefully and found what made his professional skepticism crack just slightly. Tracks, humanoid but wrong. The impressions showed 5 digits like fingers or toes, but each ended in what could only be described as talons. They were spaced far apart. Whatever made them had an impossible stride length for a human. And leading away from the tracks was a drag mark, roughly the width of a human body, heading deeper into the forest. Chris pulled out his radio again. His voice was steady, professional. "Base, this is Brennan. I need a full team at these coordinates, and contact the local tribes, particularly the Quinault. We need to consult with them immediately. Over." "Brennan, what did you find?" "Over." How could he explain? Evidence suggesting Rachel Martinez didn't leave voluntarily, and other anomalies requiring expertise outside our usual scope. "Over." After a pause. "Copy that. Team will mobilize but won't reach you until tomorrow morning with this weather. You need to evac or shelter in place?" "Over." Chris looked at the trail leading into the forest, then at the gathering darkness as the storm blocked out what little daylight remained. Every rational bone in his body said evacuate, but Rachel might still be alive. Those drag marks were recent. "I'm going to follow the trail. If I don't radio in by 1800 hours, send the team to my GPS coordinates. Over and out." He didn't wait for a response. The trail wound deeper into old-growth forest, where trees wider than cars created a twilight gloom even at midday. The storm reduced visibility further, rain cascading through the canopy in sheets. Chris used his flashlight, following the drag marks and occasional talon prints. His mind worked methodically, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Bear, but the prints were all wrong. Elk? Couldn't explain the talon marks. Mountain lion? Not the right track pattern. Human in costume? That thought made him shudder more than any animal explanation, because it implied intentionality. Implied someone dragging Rachel into these woods for a reason he didn't want to contemplate. After 40 minutes of tracking, Chris entered what Rachel's journal had called the Old Cedar Grove. The trees here were ancient, some exceeding 10 feet in diameter, their massive trunks disappearing into the mist above. And Rachel had been right. Feathers everywhere. They carpeted the ground in thick drifts, muffling his footsteps. The patterns she'd mentioned were more elaborate than she'd described. Concentric circles and spirals and symbols that tugged at some deep, primitive recognition in Chris's brain. In the center of the grove stood a cedar that dwarfed its neighbors, its trunk scarred with age and fire. The drag marks led directly to it. Chris approached slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain and mist. The smell hit him. The decay and acrid wrongness Rachel had noted, but concentrated, overwhelming. He pulled his jacket collar over his nose and mouth and continued forward. At the base of the massive cedar was an opening, a hollow in the trunk large enough for a person to fit through. The drag marks disappeared into the darkness within. Chris crouched at the entrance, shining his light inside. The hollow was deep, extending down into the root system. He could see what looked like a cavern beneath the tree, and in the weak illumination of his flashlight, shapes he couldn't quite identify. Bones, definitely. He could make out a skull that was probably deer. But there were other things, bundles of feathers and what might have been clothing, and was that movement in the darkness. Something retreating from his light. "Rachel?" His voice came out hoarse. "Rachel Martinez, can you hear me?" A sound emerged from the hollow, a low, wheezing breath that raised every hair on Chris's neck. Not words, not human, but somehow aware, intelligent. Chris made a decision that would haunt him. He couldn't fit through the opening with his pack on, and he couldn't leave it. It contained his survival gear, his radio, his only connection to help. But Rachel might be down there, might be alive and injured. He pulled out his emergency flare, cracked it, and tossed it into the hollow. Red light flooded the space beneath the cedar. What he saw in that moment of illumination would fracture his carefully constructed rational worldview forever. The cavern was a charnel house. Bones of various animals and, God help him, what were definitely human remains, picked clean and arranged in patterns. Feathers completely covered the walls, stuck there with something dark and organic. And in the back of the space, illuminated by the dying flare, was Rachel Martinez, or what was left of her. She sat propped against the far wall, her body intact but transformed into something that Chris's mind refused to accept. Her torso had been opened, her chest cavity exposed and empty, no organs visible, just a hollow space between ribs. But she was moving. Her head turned toward the light, and her eyes, those were still Rachel's eyes, filled with an awareness that was somehow worse than death. Her mouth opened, and that wheezing sound emerged again. She was trying to speak. Chris scrambled back from the opening, his heart hammering, breath coming in gasps. His hands shook as he reached for his radio. Base, this is Brennan. I found Rachel Martinez. I need immediate medical evac. The words died in his throat as his flashlight caught movement above. Perched in the branches of the surrounding cedars were owls. Dozens of them, all facing the grove center, all completely silent. But these weren't spotted owls. They were massive, each easily 3 feet tall, with plumage that seemed to absorb light. And as Chris's light swept across them, he saw with creeping horror that they all bore 2 human eyes. One dropped from its perch, wings spreading impossibly wide. It landed 20 feet from Chris and began to change. The transformation was fluid and wrong in equal measure. The owl's body seemed to unfold, bones cracking and reforming, feathers melting into skin. In the span of seconds, what had been a massive bird became a naked human figure, an elderly native man with hollow eyes and a chest that bore a vertical scar from sternum to navel. He spoke in a language Chris didn't recognize, but the meaning was clear in his tone. "You should not have come here." More owls descended, more transformations. Chris counted 5 figures now surrounding the grove, all bearing that same chest scar, all regarding him with predatory patience. His hand found the bear spray on his belt. Useless, his rational mind screamed. These aren't bears, these aren't anything natural. The first figure moved closer, and Chris saw with nauseating detail the scar opening slightly with each breath, revealing the emptiness within. The man's mouth moved, and this time Chris heard English, heavily accented but comprehensible. The woman broke the taboos. She came to the sacred groves. She followed the calls. She watched what should not be watched. The figure tilted his head at an owl-like angle. The punishment for seeing the Stikini is to become one. This is law older than your maps, older than your borders. She belongs to us now. She's alive, Chris managed to say, his voice shaking. "She needs medical help. She is beyond your medicine." The figure gestured to the hollow. "Her organs have been removed and hidden, as is our way. She will hunt with us when night comes, transformed, forever hungry. This is her punishment. This is her fate." "I don't..." Chris's scientific mind grasped for rational explanations and found none. "This isn't possible. This is..." "Your possibility matters nothing here." Another Stikini stepped forward, this one a woman who might have been beautiful before her chest was carved hollow. "But you, Ranger, you present a problem. You have seen. You know. The question is what we do with you." The circle was tightening. Chris's hand moved to his knife, another useless gesture, but what else could he do? His radio crackled with static, bass trying to reach him, the sound absurdly normal against the nightmare surrounding him. "I could run," Chris said, hating how his voice trembled. "I could tell no one. You could not outrun us." The first Stikini smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "And you would tell. You would have to tell. Your nature demands it. Truth and evidence and explanation. That is what you are." "Then what?" Chris demanded, anger cutting through fear. "You kill me? Add me to your collection? Transform me?" "We have not decided." The Stikini tilted his head again, that disturbing owl-like gesture. "The Stikini were many once. We hunted across all these forests. But your people came with their laws and their roads and their disbelief. We were driven into the deepest places, the forgotten groves. We are few now. The young forget the old ways. They do not seek the transformation. We are dying." "Good," Chris spat. "You're monsters." "We are what we have always been. Your kind made us monsters by forgetting we existed, by violating sacred spaces, by demanding proof of everything. The woman with her recordings and her scientific inquiry, she wanted to document us, to explain us, to share us with the world. So we showed her. We gave her what she sought." The Stikini's hollow chest seemed to pulse. "We gave her understanding." A low hoot echoed through the grove, and the Stikini turned as one toward the sound. One of them spoke rapidly in their language. The elderly man turned back to Chris, and something like regret crossed his face. "A choice, then. For you, Ranger. Because you came seeking to save, not to expose. You may leave. You may live. But you will take the woman's body with you, what remains of it. You will report that she died, cause unknown, body damaged by scavengers. You will destroy her research, her recordings, any evidence of what she found. And you will never speak of what you have seen here. And if I refuse, then you join her. Your organs will be removed. You will hunt with us. You will understand intimately what it means to be Stikini." Chris's mind raced. Every instinct said to refuse, to fight, to expose these creatures. But he looked at the hollow beneath the cedar tree, at what had been Rachel Martinez, and he knew he couldn't save her. She was alive but not living, transformed into something that made death seem merciful, and he was one man against creatures that bent every law of nature he understood. "How do I know you'll let me leave?" "You don't. But we do not hunt for sport, Ranger. We protect our territory. We maintain our secrets. If you become our ally in that, you may live. If you become our enemy..." The Stikini gestured to the hollow, to Rachel's transformed body. "You have seen the alternative. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. What do I need to do?" They gave him until dawn. The Stikini retrieved Rachel's body from the hollow. Chris forced himself not to look too closely at what they brought out, and wrapped it in a tarp they seemed to have specifically for this purpose. They led him back to her campsite and watched in silence as he packed up everything, taking particular care with her journals and recording devices. The symbols on the trees had multiplied in his absence. Now every tree bore the eye and claw mark. One of the Stikini spoke English. "Delete the recordings. Burn the journals. Tell them she fell, that animals scavenged her remains. Tell them she died quickly. Give the family that mercy." "Why?" Chris asked, securing Rachel's body to his pack frame. Why give me mercy at all? Because you may still be useful. Because you understand now that there are things in these forests that should remain hidden. Because the next researcher who comes, the next curious soul who violates the sacred groves, you will turn them away. You will protect our secret without knowing you do so. The Stakini were right, and Chris hated them for it. He radioed base as dawn broke through the storm. His voice was steady as he reported finding Rachel Martinez's body, cause of death uncertain, substantial trauma from post-mortem scavenging. He requested the extraction team and gave his coordinates. His report would be precise, professional, and entirely false. As he waited for the team, sitting next to Rachel's wrapped body, Chris pulled out his digital camera. He scrolled through the photos he'd taken, the campsite, the symbols, the tracks. All of it evidence, all of it proof, all of it showing nothing but blurry shapes and shadows when he looked at them now. The symbols appeared as natural bark patterns. The tracks looked like random disturbances in soil. Even the carved stone he'd found was just a smooth river rock in the photographic record. They'd known. The Stakini had known his nature, known he would try to document, and somehow they'd ensured no evidence would survive. Chris deleted the photos one by one. He spent the next week helping coordinate the official investigation, providing his account of finding Rachel's body, assisting with the recovery effort. The medical examiner's report cited massive trauma consistent with a fall and subsequent predation by local wildlife. Rachel's family mourned. Her colleagues wrote touching obituaries. Her research was filed away. And Christopher Brennan, the rational ranger who believed in evidence and logic, sat in his office and destroyed every piece of Rachel's real work. He deleted her audio files without listening to them, though he was certain he knew what they contained. He burned her journals in his fireplace, watching her handwriting curl and blacken. He crushed the obsidian stone into dust and scattered it far from the Olympic forests. He did this because he wanted to live, because he had no choice, because he was a coward, and cowards survive by keeping secrets. But here's what keeps him awake at night, 3 months later. Sometimes when he's alone in the forest, he hears those calls, the ones that sound almost like human screaming. Sometimes he feels watched by eyes that reflect his flashlight with too much intelligence. Sometimes he finds feathers arranged in patterns around his truck and symbols carved into trees along his regular patrol routes. The Stakini haven't forgotten him. They're making sure he doesn't forget them. And the worst part, the part that makes his rational mind fracture a little more each day, he can't stop himself from returning to those deep groves, from checking on the old cedar, from looking for evidence he knows he'll never capture, because some part of him, the part that saw Rachel's still aware eyes in that hollow, the part that watched men become owls and owls become men, that part needs to understand. That part needs proof, even if proof is the last thing that will keep him safe. Christopher Brennan closes his patrol report for the day and looks out his office window. The sun is setting over the Olympic Mountains, painting the forest in shades of gold and shadow. Soon it will be night. Soon the owls will call, and somewhere in the deepest groves Rachel Martinez will transform and hunt, forever hollow, forever hungry, forever aware of what she's become. Chris knows this with absolute certainty. He knows because last week, during a night patrol he couldn't quite justify, he saw her. Perched in a tree 20 miles from the sacred grove, her owl form unmistakable even in darkness. She'd watched him with those still human eyes, and in her gaze, he'd seen recognition, despair, and accusation. He'd looked away first. He always looks away first. Because Christopher Brennan has learned the final lesson of the forest. Some truths are too terrible to face, and some evidence is too dangerous to preserve. The price of knowledge sometimes is your humanity. The price of survival always is your silence. And in the Olympic National Park, in the forgotten groves where ancient things still dwell, the Stakini continue their eternal hunt. Protected by one ranger's cowardice, hidden by his lies, sustained by his silence. It's a secret Chris will keep until he dies. Unless, of course, they decide he's outlived his usefulness first. If this story gave you chills, which moment scared you most? The hollow beneath the cedar, or the realization that Rachel was still aware. Hope you felt real terror. Consider following for more authentic horror rooted in actual folklore. Robert Whitmore hadn't slept properly in 3 years. Not since the incident at Crater Lake that left him with a medical discharge recommendation he'd fought tooth and nail to overturn. The compromise had been a transfer. Olympic National Park, they'd said, was quiet, manageable, the kind of place where a ranger could ease back into the rhythm of the work without the pressure of high-traffic areas. They'd been half right. Olympic was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that pressed against your eardrums in the hours before dawn, when the temperate rainforest held its breath and waited for something Robert couldn't name. The radio crackled at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Robert was already awake, had been for an hour, watching the darkness outside his ranger station thin into the gray half-light that passed for morning this time of year. The moss on the Douglas firs outside his window had absorbed so much moisture overnight that it looked black rather than green. Dispatch to Ranger Whitmore. We have a 1057, Hoh River Trail, approximately 4 miles in. Female, early 20s, disappeared during the night. Witness on scene is her camping partner. He's requesting immediate assistance. Robert's hand tightened around his coffee mug. The ceramic was warm, but his fingers had gone cold. Copy that, dispatch. ETA 40 minutes. He kept his voice steady, professional. They didn't need to know that his pulse had already kicked into the high register it hit when things started to feel wrong. Can you provide any additional details? Static, then. Witness says the victim, Hannah Reeves, grad student from University of Washington, was out photographing fungi around 2 a.m. Bioluminescent species study, apparently. He woke up to her screaming, but by the time he got his boots on and a flashlight, she was gone. He's been searching for 3 hours, says the forest isn't. He says it's not laid out the way it was yesterday. Robert's stomach dropped. He set the mug down carefully, watching his hand to make sure it didn't shake. Repeat that last part? His words, not mine. He sounds pretty shaken up. Name's Derek Paulson. He kept saying the trees moved, but the dispatcher's skepticism was audible. Anyway, you're the closest responder. Park police are en route, but they're at least 90 minutes out. Understood. Whitmore en route. He stood, forcing himself through the practiced motions. Vest, radio, GPS unit, medkit, knife, flares, rope, emergency beacon. His hands moved automatically while his mind spun through the topology of the Hoh River Trail. He knew that path, had hiked it a dozen times in the 6 months since his transfer. 4 miles in would put them near the massive Sitka spruce, the one the Quileute elders had asked the Park Service to cordon off years ago. The request had been denied. Budget constraints, they'd said, though Robert suspected the real reason was that officially acknowledging indigenous sacred sites made the lawyers nervous. He'd seen that tree. It was old enough that its root system had probably been established before European contact. The kind of old that made you feel temporary. By 7:30 a.m., Robert was on the trail. The Hoh rainforest in October meant near constant precipitation, though this morning had granted a reprieve, just mist hanging in the canopy like held breath. The trail was soft under his boots, the decomposing matter of centuries creating a floor that absorbed sound. His footsteps made almost no noise. The first mile was standard. He'd radioed his position twice, noted the fork where the river trail split from the loop path, marked the familiar landmarks, a downed hemlock, its trunk thick enough to walk through the hollow center. A peculiar nurse log colonized by 7 different fern species. The air smelled like petrichor and cedar, underlaid with the sweet rot of decomposition that never quite left places like this. The second mile was when he noticed the birds had stopped singing. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to go quiet when humans passed through. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that preceded something, the way the air pressure changed before a storm. Robert paused, scanning the understory. Nothing moved. Even the small sounds, insects, the rustle of shrews in the leaf litter, the distant knock of woodpeckers had ceased. His radio hissed. Dispatch to Whitmore, what's your status? 2 miles in, proceeding to witness location. Conditions are... He stopped, trying to find the right word. Unusual. No wildlife activity. I'm going to need that backup expedited if possible. Copy. I'll relay. Be advised, we've had 2 other hikers report disorientation on the Ho River Trail in the past month. Both times they were found off-trail, claiming the markers disappeared. Robert's jaw tightened. They hadn't mentioned that in his morning briefing. Were they evaluated? Negative. They declined medical transport. Seemed embarrassed more than anything. Chalked it up to fatigue and poor visibility. Right. Robert signed off and kept moving, but his right hand had drifted to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Not that bear spray would help with what he was increasingly certain he was walking toward. The trees here were massive, western hemlocks and Sitka spruce that had been growing since before Washington was a state, their trunks disappearing into the canopy 60 meters above. The understory was thick with salal and sword ferns, and every surface, bark, rock, fallen logs, was carpeted in moss. It created a landscape that seemed to breathe, the endless greens shifting in shade and texture. At mile 3, Robert found Derek Paulson. The young man was sitting on a boulder beside the trail, his camp stove and tent visible in a clearing 20 yards back. He looked up when Robert approached, and the relief on his face was immediate and profound. He was maybe 24, wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked barely broken in. His hands were shaking. Thank God, I thought. He stood too quickly, swayed. I've been calling for her all morning. I tried to follow where she went, but I kept ending up back here. It doesn't make sense. I marked trees, I used my compass, but I just keep circling back. Robert put a hand on his shoulder, the gesture automatic. I'm Ranger Whitmore. Let's start from the beginning. When exactly did Hannah leave the tent? Derek ran both hands through his hair. He hadn't slept, that was obvious. Around 1:30, maybe 2 a.m. She'd been monitoring this colony of Pinellus stypticus. That's the species she's studying, they glow in the dark. She wanted to get photographs when they were most luminescent. I stayed in the tent. I heard her moving around out there with her camera for maybe 20 minutes. Then, he swallowed hard. Then I heard her scream, not like she was scared, like she was terrified, like something had grabbed her. I got up, got my light, ran out there. Her camera was on the ground, still on, but she was gone. And the trees. He looked at Robert, and there was something in his eyes that Robert recognized. The look of someone who'd seen something that broke their understanding of how the world worked. The trees weren't in the same place. I know how that sounds. But we'd been camped here for 2 days. I knew every tree around our site, and they'd moved. Or we'd moved. Or something. Robert kept his expression neutral. Show me where you found the camera. Derek led him off the main trail, pushing through sword ferns that came up to his thighs. The morning mist was starting to burn off, sending shafts of weak sunlight through the canopy. It should have made things clearer, but instead it just made the shadows sharper, more defined. After 30 yards, Derek stopped. Here, this is where it was. Robert knelt. The ground was soft, thick with humus. There were footprints, Hannah's based on the size and tread pattern, running shoes, probably trail runners, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped, as if she'd been standing here and then simply ceased to exist. He pulled out his own camera and documented the scene, then examined the area in a widening circle. The footprints didn't reappear. There were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle, no indication that she'd been carried or that she'd walked in any direction from this spot. Did you move the camera? Robert asked. No, I didn't touch it. I thought maybe there'd be evidence or something. Derek was hugging himself despite the relative warmth. There is, actually. Evidence, I mean. Look at the last photo. He pulled out a digital camera from his jacket pocket and handed it to Robert. The screen was still on, battery draining. Robert clicked to the image gallery, scrolled to the final photo. It had been taken at 1:47 a.m. according to the timestamp. The image showed a cluster of mushrooms on a rotting log, glowing a faint green in the darkness. But it wasn't the fungi that made Robert's breath catch. Behind the log, barely visible in the frame's edge, was the forest, except the trees in the photograph were impossibly large, impossibly close together, and they seemed to curve in ways that trees didn't curve. The perspective was wrong. It was as if the camera had captured a glimpse of a different forest, one that occupied the same space but didn't follow the same geometry. And there, in the far background, was a massive shape. A tree, Robert thought, but he couldn't be sure. It was too dark, too out of focus, but there was something about it that made his skin prickle. "I need you to go back to the trailhead," Robert said quietly, handing back the camera. "Right now. Follow the trail markers back. Don't leave the main path for any reason. When you get cell service, call 911 again. Tell them we need a full search and rescue team. Can you do that?" Derek nodded, but he didn't move. "You think she's alive?" Robert didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead he said, "Go, now. I'm going to start the search. If this story is keeping you on edge, follow for more immersive narratives. What would you do in Robert's position? Share your thoughts below." After Derek left, Robert stood alone in the clearing and allowed himself 60 seconds to breathe. His therapist had taught him that when the panic started to rise, when the memories of Crater Lake threatened to surface, he had 60 seconds to acknowledge it before he shoved it back down and did his job. Crater Lake had been different. At Crater Lake, the thing he'd encountered hadn't been tied to any place or legend. It had just been hungry. Wrong. Something that had crawled up from a depth where light didn't reach and had looked at Robert with recognition, as if it had known him his entire life. As if it had been waiting. He'd survived because he'd run, because he'd broken protocol and left his partner behind and run until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. They'd found Marcus 3 days later. What was left of him? This felt different. This felt purposeful. Robert keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I'm beginning a grid search pattern from the witness's last known location of the victim. I'm going to be moving off trail. If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, send everything you've got." "Copy that. Be safe, Robert." He clicked off the radio and stood still, listening. The forest was still too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just the distant white noise of the Hoh River, maybe a quarter-mile west. Then he heard it. A sound like wind chimes, delicate and crystalline, but there was no wind. Robert turned slowly. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, away from the trail. He marked his position on the GPS, took a compass bearing, and started walking. The understory thickened. Salal branches caught at his legs. The moss grew thicker, hanging from branches and curtains that brushed his face as he passed. The air temperature dropped, not dramatically, but enough that he noticed. His breath started to fog. The sound continued, always just ahead, always just out of sight. After 10 minutes, Robert realized he'd been walking uphill. That was wrong. The Hoh River Trail stayed relatively flat through this section, following the river valley. There shouldn't be a significant grade change for at least another mile. He checked his GPS. According to the unit, he'd traveled 0.3 miles northeast. But when he looked back, he couldn't see the clearing where Derek had been camping. He couldn't see anything but trees and moss and the endless green twilight of the rainforest. The wind chime sound stopped. Robert froze, hand on his radio. The silence was absolute now, not even the river's distant murmur. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the understory, the canopy, the shadows between the massive trunks. That's when he saw the first marker. It was carved into the bark of a hemlock, about chest height. Not a Park Service marker, something older. The symbol was geometric, angular, but it flowed in a way that suggested it had meaning beyond decoration. Robert had seen similar markings in the cultural center at Nia Bay, though he couldn't remember what they signified. He found the second marker 20 feet away on a Sitka spruce, then a third, a fourth. They formed a line deeper into the forest, each one carved into progressively larger trees. The route they marked didn't follow any rational path. It wove between trunks, over logs, around boulder clusters. But it was clearly deliberate. Robert followed. The trees grew larger. The light grew dimmer. The temperature continued to drop until Robert could see his breath in thick clouds. His radio hissed with static, then went silent. When he checked it, the display showed no signal. That should have been impossible this close to the ranger station. The markers led him to a clearing. It wasn't much of a clearing, just a break in the canopy where a giant had fallen centuries ago and nothing had grown tall enough to replace it yet. But in the center of the clearing stood the Sitka spruce. Robert had seen it before, from the trail. But seeing it from the trail and standing at its base were two different experiences. The trunk was at least 6 meters across, maybe 7. Its bark was deeply furrowed, colonized by entire ecosystems of lichen and moss. The root system spread out in massive serpentine coils that rose and fell like ocean swells frozen in wood. And the tree was old in a way that made Robert feel like an insect, like his entire life was a blink against the centuries this organism had weathered. At the base of the tree, placed carefully on an exposed root, was Hannah's camera bag. Robert approached slowly. His boots made no sound on the moss. When he knelt to examine the bag, he noticed that his hands were shaking again. The bag was open. Inside was Hannah's wallet, her phone, dead battery, a notebook filled with meticulous field notes about fungal growth patterns, everything except the camera itself. "Hannah?" His voice sounded too loud in the clearing. Wrong. "Hannah Reeves, this is Ranger Whitmore. If you can hear me, please respond." Nothing. Robert stood and circled the tree. On the far side, he found more markers carved into the bark. These were different. Newer, he thought, though still old enough that the cuts had weathered. They formed a pattern that spiraled up the trunk as far as he could see. And there, tucked into a hollow where a branch had broken off decades ago, was a bundle wrapped in rotting canvas. Robert's training said don't touch it. His instinct said run, but the part of him that had survived Crater Lake, the part that understood there were things in the world that operated by different rules, that part said this was important. He reached up. The hollow was just above head height, and carefully extracted the bundle. The canvas fell apart in his hands, revealing what was inside. Bones. Small bones. Bird bones, maybe, or squirrel. They'd been arranged in a specific pattern, bound together with what looked like plant fiber, and wrapped around them was a copper wire, green with verdigris, formed into a symbol that matched the carvings on the trees. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the space between heartbeats. Robert looked up. The trees around the clearing had changed position. He was certain of it. They'd closed in, or the clearing had shrunk, or space itself had contracted. The gaps between trunks that had been there moments ago were gone now, replaced by an unbroken wall of bark and moss and shadow. And in those shadows, something was moving. Not walking, not crawling. Moving the way shadows move when the light source shifts, except there was no light source. The movement was fluid, organic, purposeful, and it was all around him. Robert's breath came fast and shallow. His training said, identify the threat, establish an escape route, call for backup, but his radio was dead. His GPS showed nothing but static, and the threat wasn't something that could be identified in any conventional sense. The shadows coalesced. What emerged wasn't a figure exactly. It was more like the absence of light had taken shape, had learned to hold form long enough to be perceived. It was tall, taller than any human, tall enough that its head was level with the lowest branches of the spruce. And it was looking at Robert with something that might have been eyes, though he couldn't focus on them directly. Every time he tried, his vision slid away. Robert dropped the bundle of bones. They clattered against the root, then rolled into the moss and disappeared from view. The shadow thing moved closer. As it did, Robert heard that sound again. The wind chimes. But now he understood what it was. It was the sound of air moving through the thing's form, passing through it rather than around it. It was the sound of something that existed in the space between one moment and the next. "I'm looking for Hannah Reeves." Robert's voice cracked, but he forced the words out. "She's a student. She didn't mean any harm. She was just studying the fungi." The thing stopped. Then, impossibly, it spoke. It didn't speak in words. It spoke in the rustle of leaves, the creak of wood under stress, the distant crash of the river over stones. But somehow, Impossibly, Robert understood. Boundaries. That was all. Just that one concept, but it contained multitudes. The boundary between the living forest and the dead world humans built. The boundary between respect and exploitation. The boundary this place had maintained for longer than Robert's species had existed, and which had been violated. "Where is she?" Robert asked. His hand had dropped to his bear spray, but he knew it was useless. This wasn't something you could spray away. "Is she alive?" The shadow thing moved again, circling the massive spruce. Robert's eyes followed it, and as they did, he saw something he'd missed before. High in the branches, at least 40 feet up, something was caught in a fork where two massive limbs diverged. It was Hannah. Or it had been Hannah. Her body was draped over the branch like a discarded coat, arms dangling, head hanging at an angle that was all wrong. She wasn't moving. Even from this distance, even in the dim light filtering through the canopy, Robert could see that she'd been dead for hours. Something broke inside him, not his composure. That had already frayed. Something deeper. The part that had held on to the belief that he could save people if he just tried hard enough. If he just didn't run this time. Why? The word came out raw. She was just taking pictures. The shadow thing had stopped directly beneath Hannah's body. When it spoke again, the sound was different. Less like wind, more like the groan of wood under pressure. More like anger. She saw. Robert's mind raced through Hannah's photographs. The last image, the impossible geometry of the trees, the massive shape in the background. She'd photographed something she wasn't supposed to see, something that had been here long before the Park Service, before the rangers, before the trails and the markers and the GPS coordinates. Something that had been guarding this place when it was still called by its original name, in a language Robert didn't speak. The Guardian. The realization settled over him like cold water. This wasn't a monster. This wasn't something evil. This was exactly what Derek had said. The trees had moved, but they hadn't moved in physical space. Hannah had crossed into somewhere else, somewhere that occupied the same forest but operated by different rules. And the Guardian had responded the way Guardians always responded to intrusion. "I need to take her back," Robert said quietly. "Her family needs to bury her." The shadow thing didn't move. "Please." Robert's voice was steady now. He'd made his decision. If it took him the way it had taken Hannah, then at least he wouldn't have to live with being the ranger who ran. I understand this is your place. I understand we don't belong here, but please, let me bring her home." For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. Robert held his. Then the shadow thing moved. It flowed up the trunk of the spruce, defying gravity, defying physics, defying everything Robert thought he understood about how the world worked. When it reached Hannah's body, it paused. The wind chime sound echoed through the clearing, almost gentle now. Hannah's body began to descend. It didn't fall. It was lowered, carefully, as if held by invisible hands. Branches that shouldn't have been able to bear weight, bent to create a path. Moss cushioned her descent, and when she finally reached the ground, she was placed at the base of the spruce with a reverence that made Robert's throat tight. The shadow thing was gone. Robert stood alone in the clearing with Hannah's body and the ancient tree, and the absolute certainty that he'd been given a gift. One he didn't deserve, but one he would honor. He radioed for the recovery team, though his signal had mysteriously returned. He stayed with Hannah until they arrived 4 hours later, sitting with his back against the spruce, telling her about the forest, about the legends he'd learned from the Quileute elders, about the places where the world was thinner than people realized. The official report said Hannah Reeves had fallen while trying to photograph fungi at night. A tragic accident, easily explained by poor lighting and unfamiliar terrain. The recovery team found her at the base of the massive Sitka spruce, exactly where Robert said she would be. There was no mention of shadows or guardians or impossible geometry. But 2 weeks later, the Park Service quietly honored the decades-old request to cordon off the area around the spruce. Budget concerns, they said. were no longer an obstacle, and Robert, who had finally managed to sleep through a full night without dreaming of Marcus, knew that some boundaries existed for good reason. He never went back to that clearing. But sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung thick in the rainforest and the birds forgot to sing, Robert would stand at the trailhead and listen. And occasionally, very occasionally, he would hear the distant sound of wind chimes where there was no wind at all. Thank you for reading to the end. If this story resonated with you, follow for more atmospheric horror tales. What's your interpretation of what really happened to Hannah? Were the Guardian's actions justified? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments. Christopher Hayes had spent the better part of his adult life explaining away mysteries. As a wildlife biologist with a PhD from Cornell and 12 years of fieldwork across North America, he'd heard every superstitious tale, every campfire legend, every ranger's ghost story about the wilderness. He'd smiled politely through them all, secure in his understanding that nature, however brutal, followed predictable patterns. Predation, decomposition, animal behavior, all of it could be quantified, studied, explained. The universe didn't need monsters when it already had wolves, bears, and the simple savagery of survival. Isle Royale in October 2015 should have been just another research trip. The isolated national park, a 45-mile-long island in Lake Superior, hosted one of the longest-running predator-prey studies in the world. Christopher had been invited to consult on the declining wolf population, bringing his expertise in canid genetics and behavior. The Park Service had sent a small seaplane to fetch him from Houghton, and he'd spent the flight reviewing data on his laptop, barely glancing at the dark forests and rocky shores passing below. Samantha Torres, the 28-year-old park ranger who was supposed to meet him at the Wendigo Ranger Station, never showed up. Christopher hadn't thought much of it initially. Rangers got called away, equipment failed, schedules shifted. He'd waited at the station for 3 hours, annoying the skeletal off-season staff with questions about wolf scat samples, before someone finally radioed through that Samantha's last known position was near the Feltman Ridge Trail, where she'd been tracking what she'd described as unusual wildlife activity. When pressed, the dispatcher's voice had carried an odd tension. Samantha had missed 2 scheduled check-ins. Her GPS beacon had gone dark 6 hours ago. That was enough to transform Christopher's irritation into something resembling concern. Isle Royale wasn't a place to take missing persons lightly. The island's isolation meant limited resources for search and rescue, and November's killing cold was already creeping in. By the time a search party could be properly organized, it might be too late. Christopher had volunteered immediately, partly from genuine worry, partly from the scientists' compulsion to gather data. He'd worked with Samantha before, 3 years prior during a joint study. She'd been competent, careful, the kind of ranger who triple-checked her gear and never took unnecessary risks. If she'd missed check-ins, something was genuinely wrong. The park superintendent, a weathered man named Douglas Kerr, had looked at Christopher with an expression that seemed almost pitying. "You sure about this, Dr. Hayes? The Feltman area? Rangers don't like going there alone, especially not lately." "Superstition isn't going to find her," Christopher had replied, already shouldering his pack. "But systematic searching might." Kerr had given him a handheld radio, fresh batteries, and a map marked with Samantha's last known coordinates. Then he'd said something that Christopher would remember later, when remembering became its own form of torture. The Ojibwe who used to summer on this island had stories about certain places, about things that walk on 2 legs but aren't human anymore, about hunger that doesn't stop with death. He'd paused, seeming to measure Christopher's reaction. "Just keep your eyes open out there, and if you find something that doesn't make sense, don't try to make sense of it. Just get the hell out." Christopher had nodded with barely concealed condescension and set out into the wilderness that same afternoon. The Feltman Ridge Trail wound through some of Isle Royale's most remote terrain, a landscape of dense boreal forest broken by exposed ridges and beaver-flooded meadows. Christopher had hiked it before in summer, when the trail bustled with backpackers and the woods felt merely wild rather than hostile. October was different. The deciduous trees had already dropped their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that clawed at the gray sky. The evergreen seemed darker, more oppressive. The usual soundscape of birdsong and rustling wildlife had been replaced by an unsettling silence, broken only by the crunch of Christopher's boots on the frost-hardened trail and the distant mournful calls of ravens. He'd been hiking for 2 hours when he noticed the first anomaly. As a biologist, Christopher's eye for detail was trained to catch the subtle: a bent blade of grass, a partial print, scat composition. What he saw now wasn't subtle. It was a tree, a white birch about 20 feet from the trail, and someone, or something, had stripped the bark from it in long vertical tiers. The exposed wood underneath was scored with what looked like claw marks, except the gouges were deeper than any bear Christopher had ever documented, and the pattern was wrong, too deliberate, too intentional. He approached carefully, pulling out his camera to document the damage. The claw marks, if that's what they were, descended from about 8 feet high down to the base of the tree. Each gouge was roughly 2 inches wide and deep enough to expose the inner cambium. Christopher ran his fingers along one of the marks, frowning. The edges were jagged, not clean like a blade, but not quite right for claws either. And there was something else. A smell, faint but distinct, like spoiled meat mixed with something sharper, almost chemical. Territorial marking? He muttered to himself, falling into the comfortable habit of narrating his observations. But what species? The depth suggests significant force, possibly a large predator asserting dominance. But the wolves here don't exhibit this behavior, and the bears should be preparing for hibernation. He took multiple photographs, measurements, and samples of the damaged bark. Professional curiosity overrode any sense of unease. This was data, evidence, a mystery that science could solve. He made notes about air temperature, humidity, time of day, and moved on. The second anomaly appeared half a mile later. The trail opened onto a small clearing, and Christopher stopped so abruptly he almost tripped. The clearing's center was dominated by what could only be described as a cairn, a deliberate pile of stones stacked in a conical shape about 4 feet high. That alone wouldn't have been unusual. Hikers sometimes built cairns as markers. What made Christopher's breath catch was what decorated the cairn: bones. Dozens of them arranged in a pattern that was unmistakably intentional. Small bones, Christopher identified them as belonging to snowshoe hares, red squirrels, and various birds, had been woven into the spaces between the rocks. But at the cairn's apex, bleached white by exposure, was a skull. Christopher didn't need to get closer to identify it as canine, probably wolf, but the placement was all wrong. The skull faced the trail, empty eye sockets seeming to stare directly at him, and its lower jaw had been removed and placed several feet away, creating an unsettling sense of a frozen scream. Christopher's scientific mind cataloged the scene with practiced efficiency, but something deeper, something more primitive, sent a shiver of revulsion through him. This wasn't animal behavior. This was something else. Something that understood symbolism, ritual, warning. He circled the cairn carefully, taking photographs from every angle, noting that the ground around it had been swept clean of leaves and debris, exposing dark soil that looked freshly disturbed. No footprints, though. No sign of who, or what, had constructed this grotesque monument. Artistic vandalism, he said aloud, trying to reassure himself with the sound of his own voice. Someone with too much time and a sick sense of humor. Teenagers, maybe, or a disturbed backpacker. Nothing supernatural about twisted people. But teenagers didn't typically hike Isle Royale in late October, and disturbed backpackers didn't arrange bones with the precision of someone conducting a ceremony. Christopher reached for his radio, intending to report the cairn to the ranger station when he heard it. A sound that froze his hand halfway to the device. It was distant, echoing through the forest from somewhere northeast, and it took his brain several seconds to process what his ears were telling him. It was a scream. Human. Female. Raw with terror and pain, rising to a pitch that didn't sound like it could come from human lungs, then cutting off with devastating abruptness. "Samantha!" Christopher shouted, already running toward the sound, his pack bouncing painfully against his back. He crashed through underbrush, abandoning the trail. his scientist's caution overwhelmed by the immediate need to help. The scream had come from perhaps half a mile away, difficult to pinpoint precisely in the acoustic confusion of the forest, but Christopher ran with the desperate certainty of someone who'd just heard another human being in mortal danger. The forest seemed to fight him. Branches snagged his jacket. Hidden roots tried to trip him. The ground, covered in wet leaves, was treacherous, twice sending him sliding into painful collisions with tree trunks. But he kept running, calling Samantha's name, listening for any response, any clue to her location. He burst into another clearing, this one natural, created by a fallen giant that had taken several smaller trees down with it, and skidded to a stop so violently he nearly fell. The clearing was a massacre site. Christopher's first coherent thought, absurdly clinical, was that he was looking at a predation event. His second thought, the one that sent ice water through his veins, was that no predator he knew of hunted like this. Samantha's gear was scattered across the clearing as if it had been flung with tremendous force. Her backpack hung from a branch 15 feet up, its contents spilling out like entrails. Her sleeping bag had been shredded into ribbons that fluttered in the cold breeze. A metal water bottle lay dented and crushed as if something had gripped it with enough force to compress steel. And there was blood. Not the scattered droplets of a struggle, but quantities of blood that painted the leaves and soaked into the soil. More blood than Christopher's mind wanted to process as coming from a single human body. But there was no body. No Samantha. Christopher approached the scene with trembling legs, his breathing rapid and shallow. The scientist in him noted details even as horror tried to shut down his higher reasoning. The blood was fresh, still tacky to the touch. There were no animal tracks, no paw prints, nothing that suggested the wolves or bears that should have been responsible for this carnage. Instead, there were marks in the soft earth that Christopher's brain refused to categorize. Long, dragging impressions that could have been footprints if feet were much larger than human feet, with what might have been claw marks at their tips. And then he saw the trees. 3 birches at the clearing's edge had been marked exactly like the one he'd found on the trail, bark stripped away, deep gouges scored into the wood. But these were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds. And the pattern, Christopher's hands shook as he raised his camera. The gouges formed shapes, not random scratches, but deliberate symbols. He recognized some of them from his anthropology courses, symbols used by various indigenous peoples, but twisted somehow, corrupted into something that made his eyes hurt to follow their curves. On the largest tree, carved at eye level, was a mark that stood out from the others. A circle bisected by a vertical line, with branching marks extending from it like antlers or reaching fingers. Beneath it, someone had scratched words into the bark with what must have been tremendous force. Wendigo. Christopher knew that word. It had come up in his research on wolf behavior, mentioned in the historical accounts of the Ojibwe people who had lived on and around Isle Royale for centuries before white settlers arrived. Wendigo in English, a malevolent spirit associated with winter, famine, and cannibalism. An entity of insatiable hunger that possessed humans, transforming them into monsters with an endless appetite for human flesh. Folklore, mythology, a cultural explanation for extreme survival situations and the taboo of cannibalism. Nothing more. But Christopher's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he photographed the word. And the smell in the clearing. That same combination of decay and something sharper that he'd noticed at the first marked tree was stronger here, almost overpowering, making him gag. He pulled out his radio with fumbling fingers. Base, this is Hayes. I found evidence of Ranger Torres, coordinates approximately. He checked his GPS, rattled off numbers. I need immediate extraction and search team. There's been an incident. Possible wildlife attack, but... He paused, not knowing how to articulate what he was seeing. It's not like anything in the literature. There's blood, destroyed equipment, but no body. Signs of struggle, but no clear predator identification. And there are markings, symbols. Someone or something has been... The radio exploded with static so intense that Christopher dropped it, the device hitting the ground and continuing to screech white noise. He bent to retrieve it, twisting the dials, but got only fragments of what might have been a voice. Can't. Extraction. Weather. 3 days. Then silence. Complete radio failure. Christopher stared at the useless device, then at the darkening sky visible through the canopy. 3 days until extraction? That couldn't be right. He looked at his watch. 4:47 p.m. Sunset would come in less than an hour, and he was miles from the nearest shelter, standing in a blood-soaked clearing with no working communication and evidence of something that challenged everything he thought he understood about nature. The rational choice was to mark this location, return to the trail, hike back to the ranger station by headlamp if necessary. Report everything, wait for professional search and rescue with proper equipment and support. But rationality was struggling against the image of Samantha's blood soaking into the earth, against the memory of that scream, against the growing certainty that, if she was still alive, and some desperate part of him believed she might be, she didn't have 3 days. Christopher made his decision. He would follow the trail from this clearing, look for any sign of where Samantha might have been taken, or where she might have fled. He'd give himself until full darkness, then reassess. He wasn't abandoning her to whatever had done this. He shouldered his pack, pulled out his flashlight even though he didn't need it yet, and began examining the clearing's perimeter for any indication of direction. The dragging marks in the soil seemed to lead northeast, deeper into the island's interior, toward the elevated ridges where the forest gave way to exposed rock and stunted vegetation. He'd gone perhaps 20 yards following what might have been a trail through crushed undergrowth when he found it. A hand. Pale, partially covered by leaves, fingers curled into a claw. Christopher's heart lurched, and he rushed forward, dropping to his knees, already knowing with sick certainty what he would find. It was Samantha's hand, just the hand, severed cleanly at the wrist as if by a surgical blade, though Christopher saw no blade marks, no tearing that would suggest an animal bite. It had simply been separated, removed with precision. The fingers were twisted in a gesture that might have been reaching or warding off, and caught between the thumb and forefinger was something small and white. Christopher gently extracted it, his stomach churning. It was a bone bead carved with intricate patterns strung on a fragment of sinew. He recognized it as similar to traditional Ojibwe prayer beads, used in spiritual ceremonies, but this one felt wrong in his palm, too cold, almost burning with that coldness. He dropped it as if it had shocked him, watching it fall to the leaves. When he looked back at Samantha's hand, his breath caught. The fingers were moving. Not the random twitching of dead nerves, Christopher knew that phenomenon, but deliberate movement, the index finger extending to point directly northeast, deeper into the darkening forest. "No," Christopher whispered, scrambling backward. "No, that's not possible. Neurological activity ceases, muscles don't contract without... The hand pointed, accusing and directing, impossible and undeniable. Christopher ran, not following the pointing hand, but away from it, back toward the trail, back toward rationality and safety in the world where severed hands didn't move, and symbols weren't carved by invisible claws and screams didn't cut off mid-terror into absolute silence. He ran with the panicked speed of prey, his scientific detachment finally comprehensively shattered. He'd covered perhaps 100 yards when he realized 3 things simultaneously. First, it was darker than it should be. The sun hadn't set, but the forest had dimmed as if night was falling hours early. Second, he no longer recognized his surroundings. The trail he thought he'd been following had somehow disappeared, leaving him in dense forest with no clear path. Third, and most horrifying, he was being followed. He couldn't see what tracked him, but he could hear it. The crack of branches too thick for wind to break, the rustle of something large moving through underbrush, and worst of all, a sound that might have been breathing if breathing usually rattled like wind through a hollow tree, wet and hungry and wrong. Christopher spun in a circle, his flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed to move independently of his light source. His training screamed at him to identify the predator, to understand its behavior, but his lizard brain, that ancient part of human consciousness that still remembered being prey, just screamed at him to hide. He saw a massive fallen log, its interior hollowed by decades of rot, and wedged himself into the opening, pulling branches and debris across the entrance, trying to make himself invisible, trying to become small and insignificant and beneath notice. His breath came in ragged gasps that he tried desperately to quiet, one hand clamped over his mouth, the other clutching his flashlight with white-knuckled intensity. The sounds of pursuit stopped. The forest fell into a silence so complete that Christopher could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He waited, barely breathing, every muscle locked in terrified stillness. Then he heard it speak. Christopher. His name, drawn out and distorted, spoken in a voice that might once have been human but had been corrupted into something that scraped against his eardrums like rusted metal. I can smell your fear, tacistes like copper and desperation. Christopher's mind gibbered denials. Animals didn't speak. Couldn't speak. This was trauma, hallucination, psychological break. He was in shock from discovering Samantha's remains. His brain was creating auditory hallucinations to process the horror. You don't believe, the voice continued. And now Christopher could place its origin. It came from directly above his hiding spot, as if something was standing on top of the log. The scientist, so certain, so ignorant. But you'll believe soon. You'll understand what Samantha understood when she opened the wrong door, when she stepped where the earth is still hungry, when she broke the old laws. A scraping sound, like bone on wood. Christopher looked up through a gap in the branches covering his hollow, and his mind tried very hard to reject what his eyes reported. Something was crouched on the log above him. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and bent at too many angles. In the dying light, Christopher caught impressions rather than clear images. Pale skin stretched too tight over a skeletal frame, fingers that ended in black claws, and a head that seemed to be mostly jaw, filled with teeth that gleamed like broken glass. But worst were the eyes, sunken deep in the skull, glowing with a sick yellowish light, radiating not just hunger but malicious intelligence. The Ojibwe called me Wendigo, it said, and the jaw didn't move right when it spoke, opening too wide, revealing a throat that seemed to descend into impossible depths. Your kind called me myth, legend, campfire story. But I was here before your books and theories. I was here when the first humans came to this island and learned what happens when hunger becomes entity, when cannibalism becomes curse, when the barrier between flesh and spirit dissolves. Christopher wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except cower in his hiding spot, but his body had locked up completely, prey response overriding every other instinct. Samantha, he managed to croak, what did you do to her? The thing that called itself Wendigo made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could carry the weight of centuries of malevolence. She is transforming. The process has begun. Soon she will be like me, forever hungry, forever hunting, forever caught between death and something much, much worse. She will thank me eventually. They always do, when the hunger becomes everything, when there's no more doubt, no more fear, just the beautiful simplicity of endless appetite. It lowered its head, that terrible skull face, until it was level with the gap in the branches, and Christopher found himself staring directly into those yellow eyes. But you I will enjoy breaking, the skeptic, the rationalist. I will strip away every certainty you've ever held until you're screaming prayers to gods you don't believe in, begging for mercy from a universe you thought was indifferent, trying to bargain with a monster you thought was folklore. One of those impossibly long arms reached toward the gap, claws extending, and Christopher finally broke his paralysis. He scrambled backward through the hollow log, emerging from the far end, and ran blindly into the forest as behind him he heard that rattling breath and the crack of wood as the Wendigo tore apart his hiding place with casual, terrifying strength. He didn't think, didn't plan, just ran on adrenaline and pure survival instinct. The forest was fully dark now, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, showing him glimpses of trees and rocks and his own clouded breath in the suddenly frigid air. Behind him he could hear pursuit, Not the huffing of an animal exerting itself, but that same wet, rattling breathing, constant and unhurried, the sound of something that didn't tire, that could chase forever. Christopher's foot caught on a root and he went down hard, his flashlight flying from his grip, tumbling into darkness. He crawled forward on hands and knees, feeling for the light, his fingers scrabbling through wet leaves and cold mud. His hand closed on the flashlight just as he heard that voice again, much closer. Running is pointless. This island is mine, has been mine for 10,000 winters. You can run to every corner, hide in every hollow, and I will always find you. Always. This is my territory, marked in bone and blood and the slow corruption of everything that enters here. Christopher turned off the flashlight, plunging himself into absolute darkness, and pressed his back against a tree, trying to become invisible. He could hear the Wendigo moving, circling, searching. It was playing with him, he realized. It could have caught him easily. This was entertainment, the cat toying with the mouse, the predator enjoying the hunt more than the kill. His hand brushed against something at his belt, the small knife he carried for field work, barely 4 inches of blade, useless against a bear, absurd against whatever this was. But it was something, a token of resistance, and Christopher found himself gripping it with desperate intensity. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had become meaningless in the dark, measured only by the hammer of his heart and the periodic sounds of something large moving through nearby underbrush. Christopher's rational mind tried to reassert itself, tried to find explanations. Mass hallucination from contaminated water, ergot poisoning from grain in his supplies, extreme stress manifesting as auditory and visual psychosis. But he'd touched that hand, Samantha's hand. That had been real. The blood had been real. And the thing hunting him, whether it was truly a Wendigo or something his traumatized mind had constructed from folklore and fear, was real enough to kill him. He needed a plan. Needed to think like a scientist, not prey. The thing had mentioned Samantha transforming, which implied she was still alive somewhere. It had mentioned boundaries, old laws, violations. If this was truly rooted in Ojibwe mythology, and Christopher's mind cringed at accepting that premise, but survival demanded flexibility, then there might be traditional protections, wards, ways to fight back. Fire. Many traditions used fire against malevolent spirits. Christopher had waterproof matches in his pack, and enough paper and dry material to start a blaze if needed. Salt, protection circles, specific prayers or invocations. He was grasping at superstitious straws, trying to fight a nightmare with fairy tales. But what else did he have? Science couldn't explain what was happening. Logic couldn't protect him from something that shouldn't exist. Christopher waited until the sounds of pursuit had moved a significant distance away, then carefully, silently, began unpacking his gear in the dark. He found his matches, a small container of salt he'd brought for cooking, and, after some fumbling, a length of red cord he'd been using to mark survey boundaries. Red thread featured in multiple protective traditions. Maybe it would help. Maybe it would do nothing. But doing something felt better than cowering. He worked in absolute darkness, using only his sense of touch, creating a rough circle around himself with the salt, then weaving the red cord between nearby trees, trying to remember fragments of anthropology lectures from a decade ago. Protection circles, sacred spaces. The idea that some symbols and substances could create barriers that supernatural entities couldn't cross. Desperate nonsense. But desperate was all he had. He settled in the center of his makeshift circle and waited for dawn, knowing that dawn might never come, that he might die here in the dark. Another cautionary tale about arrogant scientists who thought they understood nature, who thought the world had no more mysteries, no more monsters, nothing that couldn't be explained by rational thought and peer-reviewed research. The night stretched on, and Christopher Hayes, Ph.D. in wildlife biology, decorated researcher, published author, proud skeptic, found himself praying to gods he didn't believe in, making desperate bargains with a universe he'd always insisted was indifferent, and finally, completely terrifyingly understanding that there were things in the wilderness that predated science, that laughed at rational explanation, that existed in the spaces between what was known and what could never be explained. And somewhere out there in the darkness, something ancient and hungry was laughing at him, savoring his terror, waiting for the moment when his makeshift protections failed and Christopher Hayes would learn the final lesson. Some things in the wilderness aren't meant to be studied. They're meant to be feared. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Christopher's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?